Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, three critical countries in the Middle East who have been somewhat supportive of the United States. They also have segments of their population that look at Osama bin Laden as a hero. If we demand that they support us, do we risk destabilizing those governments?
No, I think you've got to recognize, from the standpoint of the Saudis, for example, they're a prime target for this organization of terrorists, Osama bin Laden. He's adamantly opposes the Saudi royal family. Probably second only to the United States would be his hatred for the current government in Saudi Arabia. With respect to Egypt, for example, and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, these are groups and organizations that have threatened the government of Egypt in the past. President Mubarak's been the target of several assassination attempts during the course of his career, some of them promulgated by these kinds of groups and organizations. So I think governments, friends of the United States, the governments you mentioned, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, etc., they understand very clearly that it's as much in their interest as it is in ours that we end these kinds of activities and that we put a stop to this kind of international terrorism, and I think they'll be prepared to help us.
Mr. Vice President, how difficult and delicate is it to send this message that we're going to uproot terrorism and Osama bin Laden and some other cells, but that this is not a war against Islam and not a war against all Arab people?
We have to continually remind folks of that. The President's been very clear, and it would be a huge mistake for we as Americans to assume that this represents some kind of, or should lead us to some kind of condemnation of Islam. That's clearly not the case. This is a perversion, if you will, of some of these religious beliefs by an extremist group. We have extremists associated with, every imaginable religion in the world. But this is by no means a war against Islam. We've got a great many Arab Americans, for example, who are first-class, loyal American citizens. We need to make certain that we don't make the mistake of assuming that everybody who comes from a certain ethnic group or a certain religious background is somehow to be blamed for this. Clearly, that's not the case. They are as appalled by it as we are.
When Osama bin Laden took responsibility for blowing up the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, U.S. embassies, several hundred died, the United States launched 60 Tomahawk missiles into his training sites in Afghanistan. It only emboldened him. It only inspired him and seemed even to increase his recruitment. Is it safe to say that that kind of response is not something we're considering in that kind of minute magnitude?
I want to be careful here, Tim, because that clearly would be inappropriate for me to talk about operational matters, specific options or the kinds of activities we might undertake going forward. We do indeed, though, have, obviously, the world's finest military. They've got a broad range of capabilities, and they may well be given missions in connection with this overall task and strategy. We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We've got to spend time in the shadows and in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in, and so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
There have been
hours after the attacks, it is later revealed a U.S. shadow government is formed. Initially deployed on the fly, executive directives on government continuity in the face of a crisis dating back to the Reagan administration are put into effect. Approximately 100 mid-level officials are moved to underground bunkers and stay there 24 hours a day. Officials rotate in and out on a 90-day scale. When its existence is later revealed, some controversy will arise because the shadow government includes no Democrats. In fact, top congressional Democrats remain unaware of it until journalists will break the story months later. Journalists from the Washington Post and CBS News. A week later, the Justice Department publishes an interim regulation allowing non-citizens suspected of terrorism to be detained without charge for 48 hours or an additional reasonable period of time in the event of an emergency or other extraordinary circumstance. The new rule is used to hold hundreds indefinitely until the Patriot Act passes in October, providing more solid grounds to hold non-citizens without charge. On September 19th, the first draft of what will later be called the Patriot Act is introduced to Congress. However, due to congressional opposition of its broad powers, the act is revised and reintroduced 2 weeks later. President Bush announces the new cabinet-level Office of Homeland Security to be led by Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge on September 20th, 2001. Accepting the post, Ridge says, "Liberty is the most precious gift we offer our citizens." Responding to this comment, the Village Voice opines, "Could Tom Ridge have said anything scarier or more telling as he accepted the post of Homeland Security czar? Trying to strike the bell of liberty, he sounds its death knell, depicting government not as the agent of the people's will, but as an imperious power with the authority to give us our democratic freedoms, which means, of course, that it can also take them away." Press Secretary Ari Fleischer warns there are reminders to all Americans that they need to watch what they say and watch what they do. Fleischer was responding to comments made by Bill Maher, the host of the discussion comedy show Politically Incorrect. Maher said that the hijackers were not cowards, but that it was a cowardly act for the United States to launch cruise missiles on targets thousands of miles away. Many advertisers and affiliate stations pulled their support of the show in response. Days later, ABC would cancel Maher's show at the end of its season because of the controversy. Several journalists are fined around the same time for even criticizing President Bush. Fleischer's comments and the general chill on free speech are widely criticized by major newspapers, for instance. On October 2nd, the Anti-Terrorism Patriot Act is introduced in Congress, but it is not well received by all. One day later, Senate Majority Leader and future anthrax target Tom Daschle says he doubts the Senate will take up the bill in the 1 week timetable the administration wants. As head of the Senate, Daschle has great power to block or slow passage of the bill. Attorney General John Ashcroft accuses Senate Democrats of dragging their feet. 2 days later, Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman and future anthrax target Patrick Leahy, also a Democrat, accuses the Bush administration of reneging on an agreement on the anti-terrorist bill. Leahy is in a key position to block or slow the bill. Some warn that lawmakers are overlooking constitutional flaws in their rush to meet the administration's timetable. 2 days later, Ashcroft complains about the rather slow pace over his request for law enforcement powers and remain hard feelings toward them. The anthrax letters would later be sent to Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy on October 9th. 3 days later, after the anthrax letters are sent, Attorney General John Ashcroft encourages federal agencies to deny requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act. In a memo to all government departments and agencies, he states, "When you carefully consider FOIA requests and decide to withhold records in whole or in part, you can be assured that the Department of Justice will defend your decisions." This is a dramatic shift from the Clinton administration, which instructed federal officials to grant all information requests unless there was a foreseeable harm in doing so. The New York Times notes that while the new policy was announced after 9/11, it had been planned well before the attacks. On October 20th, 2001, the New York Times reports that although 830 people have been arrested in the 9/11 terrorism investigation, a number that eventually exceeds between 1,200 and 2,000 people, there is no evidence that anyone now in custody was a co-conspirator in the 9/11 attacks. Furthermore, none of the nearly 100 people still being sought by the FBI is seen as a major suspect. Of all the people arrested, only 4, Zacarias Moussaoui, Ayub Ali Khan, Muhammad Asmath, and Nabil al-Maraba are connected to al-Qaeda. 3 of those are later cleared of ties to al-Qaeda after being kept in solitary confinement for more than 8 months without seeing a judge or being assigned a lawyer. Al-Maraba pleads guilty to the minor charge of entering the United States illegally and is deported to Syria. There is considerable evidence al-Maraba did have ties to al-Qaeda and even the 9/11 plot. On September 12th of 2002, after a year in solitary confinement and 4 months before he was able to contact a lawyer, Muhammad Asmath pleads guilty to 1 count of credit card fraud and is released with time served. Ayub Ali Khan, whose real name is apparently Syed Gul Muhammad Shah, is given a longer sentence for credit card fraud, but is released and deported by the end of 2002. By December 2002, only 6 are known to still be in custody. October 26, 2001. President George Bush signs the Patriot Act into law. There are a number of provisions. 1. Non-citizens can be detained and deported if they provide assistance for lawful activities of any group the government chooses to call a terrorist organization. Under this provision, the Secretary of State can designate any group that has ever engaged in violent activity as a terrorist organization. Representative Patsy Mink notes that in theory, supporters of Greenpeace could now be convicted for supporting terrorism. 2. Immigrants can be detained indefinitely, even if they are found not to have any links to terrorism. They can be detained indefinitely for immigration violations, or if the Attorney General decides their activities pose a danger to national security. They need never be given a trial or even a hearing on their status. 3. Internet service providers can be ordered to reveal the websites and email addresses that a suspect has communicated or visited. The FBI need only inform a judge that the information is relevant to an investigation. 4. It lays the foundation for a domestic intelligence gathering system of unprecedented scale and technological prowess. It allows the government to access confidential credit reports, school records, and other records without consent or notification. All of this information can now be given to the CIA in violation of the CIA's mandate prohibiting it from spying within the United States. 5. Financial institutions are encouraged to disclose possible violations of law or suspicious activities by any client. The institution is prohibited from notifying the person involved that it made such a report. The term suspicious is not defined, so it is up to the financial institution to determine when to send such a report. 6. Federal agents can easily obtain warrants to review a library patron's reading and computer habits. 7. The government can refuse to reveal how evidence is collected against a suspected terrorist defendant. The law passes without public debate. Even though it ultimately took 6 weeks to pass the law, there was no hearing or congressional debate. Congressman Barney Frank said that this was the least democratic process for debating questions fundamental to democracy I have ever seen. A bill drafted by a handful of people in secret, subject to no committee process, comes before us immune from amendment. Only 66 congresspeople and 1 senator, Russell Feingold, vote against it. Few in Congress are able to read summaries, let alone the fine print, before voting on it. Feingold would later say, the new law goes into a lot of areas that have nothing to do with terrorism and have a lot to do with the government and the FBI having a wish list of things they want to do. Supporters point out that some provisions will expire in 4 years, but in fact, most provisions will never expire. At the end of October, the Justice Department issues a regulation that allows eavesdropping on attorney-client conversations in federal prisons wherever there is reasonable suspicion to believe that a particular inmate may use communications with attorneys to further or facilitate acts of terrorism. The regulation requires written notice to the inmate and attorney, except in the case of prior court authorization. Officials no longer have to show probable cause or get a court order. The Los Angeles Times says the new policy is sharply criticized by a broad array of lawyers and lawmakers. On November 1st, 2001, Bush signs an executive order which limits public access to papers of all presidents since 1980. A 1978 law provided for the release of presidential papers 12 years after the president leaves office, so Reagan's papers could have been released next year. Reagan issued an order in 1989 that called for disclosure of most of its official papers 12 years after he left office, but under the new executive order, the papers can be kept secret even if the president in question wants them released. President Bush's father was vice president during the Reagan administration. The Guardian would later note that now Bush's personal papers detailing the decision-making process in the current war on terrorism could remain secret in perpetuity. Days later, the Justice Department announced that it has put 1,182 people into secret custody since 9/11. Most, all of them, are from the Middle East or South Asia. After this, it stops releasing new numbers, but human rights groups believe the total number could be as high as 2,500. Apparently, this is roughly the peak for secret arrests, and eventually, most of the prisoners are released, and none are charged with any terrorist acts. On November 13th, President Bush issued a 3-page executive order authorizing the creation of military commissions to try non-citizens alleged to be involved in international terrorism. The president will decide which defendants will be tried by military commissions. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld will appoint each panel and set its rules and procedures, including the level of proof needed for conviction. A 2/3 vote is needed to convict the defendant and impose a sentence, including life imprisonment or death. Only the president or the Secretary of Defense has the authority to overturn a decision. There is no provision for any appeal to U.S. civil courts, foreign courts, or international tribunals. Nor does the order specify how many judges are to preside on a tribunal or what qualifications they must have. The order also adopts the rule of evidence stemming from the 1942 Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Quirin that says evidence shall be omitted as would have probative value to a reasonable person. This rule, according to Judge Evan Wallach, was repeatedly used in World War II and in the post-war tribunals to admit evidence of a quality or obtained in a manner which would make it inadmissible under the rules of evidence in both courts of the United States or court-martials conducted by the armed forces of the United States. Evidence derived from torture, for example, could theoretically be admitted. It should be noted that the order is unprecedented among presidential directives in that it takes away some individuals' most basic rights while claiming to have the power of law, with the U.S. Congress not having been so much as consulted. During the next few years, lawyers will battle over the exact proceedings of the trials before military commissions, with many of the military lawyers arguing for more rights for their defendants, and with Haynes and the Justice and White House lawyers, Alberto Gonzales, David Addington, and Flanagan, taking a more restrictive line. Both Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell were left outside of the circle during the drafting of this directive. Rice was reportedly angry about not being informed. Later in the month, it appears that even as the U.S. is allowing some Taliban to secretly fly out of Afghanistan, it allowed a brutal massacre of others. The Sunday Herald would later report, it seems established almost beyond doubt that the US soldiers oversaw and took part in horrific crimes against humanity, which resulted in the death of thousands of Taliban supporters who surrendered after Kunduz fell to the Northern Alliance. The documentary Afghan Massacre, Convoy of Death, exposes this news widely in Europe, but the massacre remains virtually unreported in the United States. A week later, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft would say, to those who pit Americans against immigrants, citizens against non-citizens, to those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve. They give ammunition to America's enemies and pause to America's friends. They encourage people of goodwill to remain silent in the face of evil. It seemed that the attacks of September 11th hasn't made the federal government victim. They are the terrorists, the ones who abuse the civil liberties that the Arab fundamentalists could only dream of doing.